So again, there's three concepts that we need to include here. We've got identity-based versus goal-based habits. We've got the concept that different habits take different periods of time to adopt depending on the person and the habit, and that there are these what I call linchpin habits, certain habits that make other habits easier to execute. And those linchpin habits always are things that we enjoy doing. So our goal throughout this episode is for you to identify which habits are easy for you to perform, which ones are hard for you to perform, and which habits you want to break. If you want to grab a pen and paper, you can do that, or if you want to dictate some of that into your phone, you can. But right now, actually, if you just want to think about these concepts, you can always go back later. I'll make sure to spell out a very specific way that you can chart out a map towards forming particular habits and breaking particular habits later on. What I'd like us to do at this point is to take that concept of limbic friction and for you to ask yourself what habits you perform on a daily basis. And these could be things as basic as brushing your teeth before breakfast or brushing your teeth after breakfast. It could be, for instance, that you get exercise or you get it at a particular time of day, or even that you take a particular route to work, right? We are very habitual, and we tend to do things more or less over and over in the same way unless we intervene in ourselves. That's just the way that we are wired. So now I'd like to shift to thinking about a particular aspect of habits, and that's habit strength. You all have different habits. You probably brush your teeth at a particular time of day. You probably exercise at particular times a week. You probably go to the refrigerator in a very habitual way. We are incredibly habitual organisms. Unless we intervene in our habits, they tend to carry out the same way that they always have once they've formed. So you can do this exercise now. You don't have to write this down if you don't want to, but you certainly are welcome. We're going to evaluate what's called habit strength. That's not a concept that I created. Habit strength is something that you will find in the psychological literature. Habit strength is measured by two main criteria. The first is how context dependent a given habit is. So context dependence is if you go from one environment to the next, do you tend to do the same thing in the same way at the same time of day? So for instance, brushing your teeth first thing in the morning, maybe some of you do that before breakfast, maybe some of you do that later, maybe some of you, like me, don't even eat breakfast. But when I travel, I tend to brush my teeth at more or less the same time of day relative to when I wake up as I do when I'm at home. So it's context independent. So it's a very strong habit, right? There are certain behaviors like perhaps what you eat or, perhaps how you dress that are context independent, that you might perform one way in one context and another way in another context. The other aspect of habit strength is how much limbic friction is required to perform that habit on a regular basis. This is extremely important because if you are in the process of building habits and consolidating those habits, then it's probably going to take more limbic friction to execute those habits. What do I mean by that? Well, let's say you set out to get, let's say, 45 minutes of zone 2 cardio exercise every day, 5 or maybe even 7 days a week. Well, if at first you're highly motivated, limbic friction might be pretty low. Limbic friction is how much top-down, meaning from your forebrain to your limbic system, the part of your brain that generates autonomic responses, how much limbic friction, meaning conscious override of your state, is required in order to engage in that particular behavior. So if you're feeling particularly tired and you don't want to get up out of bed and you don't want to go out and do your zone 2 cardio, then there's a high degree of limbic friction. It takes more, some people think of it as motivation, but motivation is a bit of a vague concept, whereas limbic friction involves specific neural circuits, and you can think of it in a more or less quantitative way. You can think of that your body is very tired, so it's going to take more limbic friction in order to get into action, right? You're going to have to overcome more limbic friction, Whereas if you're very, very alert, there's less limbic friction because you're moving towards something that's action-oriented. However, the inverse is also true. Let's say that you are trying to get into the habit, or you're in the early stages of forming a habit to meditate regularly. That's a pretty quiescent or calming activity. So if you're somebody who comes home from work and you're very anxious and you have a lot of work to do and you have to deal with a bunch of things, there's a lot of limbic friction to overcome in order to get into that calm state.